What if I told you that in ancient Rome, being a male concubine wasn't just about pleasure, but about surviving a world where your body was currency and your dignity was expendable? Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most disturbing yet fascinating topics, the horrific reality of male concubines in the Roman Empire. But before we explore their tragic stories, we need to understand the twisted social system that created them. Picture this. You're living in a civilization where marriage isn't about love, it's about political alliances. Where your worth as a person is determined not by who you are, but by how much power you hold over others. This was ancient Rome, a society built on dominance, control, and rigid social hierarchies that would shock us today. In Roman society, relationships weren't defined by gender the way we understand them now. There were no labels like gay or straight. Instead, everything revolved around one crucial question: who's on top? And I don't just mean literally, though that was part of it. Romans cared about power dynamics above all else. The dominant partner, usually older and more powerful, maintained their masculine status and social respect. But the passive partner, the one who submitted, faced a completely different reality. Here's where it gets disturbing. If you were an adult Roman man caught in the submissive role, you weren't just breaking social norms. You were essentially destroying your entire identity as a Roman citizen. This stigma was so powerful that it could ruin careers, destroy families, and turn respected citizens into social outcasts overnight. But let's talk about the exceptions, because they reveal something even more sinister about Roman society. When the passive partner was young, often just a teenager, the relationship was not only acceptable, but encouraged. These arrangements, borrowed from Greek customs, were called pederasty. An older man, known as the Erasts, would form an intimate relationship with a teenage boy called the Eromenos. Now, Romans dressed this up as mentorship and education. The older partner would teach the younger about politics, philosophy, and how to navigate Roman society. But make no mistake, these relationships were fundamentally about power and control, with the younger partner having virtually no agency in the arrangement. The reality for these young men was far from the romanticized version we sometimes see in historical accounts. They were essentially trapped in relationships where their consent was irrelevant. Their future was decided by others, and their bodies belonged to whoever held power over them. Let's look at some specific examples that show just how twisted this system could become. Take Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most powerful leaders. Despite his commanding presence on the battlefield and in politics, rumors constantly swirled that in his private relationships with men, he preferred the submissive role. To Romans, this wasn't just gossip. It was deeply confusing and scandalous. How could someone so dominant in public choose submission in private? These rumors followed Caesar throughout his career, undermining his authority and providing ammunition for his political enemies. The disconnect between his public persona and alleged private preferences made him the subject of relentless mockery, political cartoons, and backroom insults. In a culture obsessed with masculine dominance, even whispers of submission could be politically devastating. Then we have Emperor Hadrian, whose story with his beloved Antinous reveals both the heights of Roman privilege and the depths of the power imbalance in these relationships. Hadrian didn't just care for Antinous, he was completely obsessed with him. He ensured the young man received the finest education, brought him on imperial journeys throughout the Roman world, and showered him with luxuries beyond imagination. But here's the dark side of this seemingly romantic tale. Antinous had no choice in any of this. He was essentially Hadrian's property, elevated to a privileged position, but still fundamentally powerless. When Antinous mysteriously drowned in the Nile River during one of their travels, Hadrian's reaction was extreme, even by imperial standards. Overcome with grief, Hadrian immortalized Antinous in ways no emperor had ever done for a lover. He built an entire city named Antinopolis near the site of the boy's death, had his body mummified, commissioned coins bearing his face, erected statues throughout the empire, and most incredibly, declared him a god. This was unprecedented. Very few mortals were ever elevated to divine status in Rome, and Antinous became one of them solely because of his relationship with the emperor. But what does this tell us about the reality for male concubines? While Antinous was elevated to godhood after death, he spent his life as essentially a glorified slave, albeit one with extraordinary privileges. His story, while exceptional in its outcome, illustrates the fundamental powerlessness of these young men, regardless of how much their patrons claim to love them. The situation becomes even more disturbing when we examine Emperor Nero's relationships. Nero didn't just keep male lovers discreetly within palace walls. He married them. Not once, but twice. In one case, Nero married a former slave named Pythagoras. But here's the shocking twist. Nero played the role of the bride, donning a bridal veil and participating in a full wedding ceremony publicly. This spectacle left Rome stunned. How could an emperor, the ultimate symbol of Roman masculinity, choose to publicly portray himself in the submissive feminine role? The confusion and outrage were widespread. Rome's rigid social expectations didn't allow for this kind of flexibility, especially not from their rulers. Later, Nero took another bold step, marrying a young male slave named Sporus. But this time, to calm public outrage and protect his image, Nero played the masculine role. The message was clear. Even an emperor had to walk a fine line between personal passion and public performance. But here's where Nero's story takes a truly horrific turn. In perhaps the most disturbing account of abuse in imperial Rome, Nero had Sporus castrated. This wasn't done out of affection or personal desire, but to maintain the illusion of a traditional male-female marriage dynamic. By physically mutilating Sporus, Nero ensured the public saw him not as a boy, but as a symbolic bride, allowing the emperor to assert masculine dominance and social control. This act wasn't isolated. Several ancient sources describe Nero as abusive and manipulative in his romantic entanglements. While it's difficult to know how much is historical fact and how much is politically motivated slander, the pattern of cruelty, even in relationships that were supposedly based on love, is hard to ignore. The story of Sporus reveals the ultimate horror of being a male concubine in ancient Rome. You could be mutilated, abused, and degraded, all in service of maintaining your patron's public image and social standing. Your body wasn't your own, your future wasn't your choice, and your suffering was irrelevant compared to the political and social needs of those who owned you. Emperor Tiberius presents another disturbing case study. As Rome's second emperor, Tiberius was known for withdrawing from public life in his later years, retreating to lavish seaside villas, most famously on the island of Capri. There, away from the spotlight of the capital, rumors emerged about his private lifestyle that were shocking even by Roman standards. Ancient writers described his behavior as eccentric, indulgent, and far removed from traditional Roman values. Some claimed that Tiberius surrounded himself with a young entourage, officially brought in to serve the imperial household. But according to these sources, the emperor's interest in them crossed every boundary of acceptable behavior. These accounts painted him as a ruler who misused his isolation and unlimited power to abuse those under his control. While many of these tales were likely exaggerated or fueled by political agendas, they serve as a reminder of how unchecked power, especially behind closed doors, could lead to horrific abuse. What made the situation even more tragic for male concubines was the complete lack of legal protection or social support. Unlike Roman wives, who had some legal rights and family protection, male concubines existed in a legal gray area. They could be bought, sold, abused, or discarded without any recourse. Their status depended entirely on the whims of their patrons. The psychological trauma of this existence must have been immense. Imagine being torn from your family as a child, sold into a life where your body belonged to someone else, where you had to perform not just sexually, but emotionally, pretending to enjoy relationships that were fundamentally about their exploitation. Many of these young men came from conquered territories, captured as spoils of war, or sold by desperate families facing economic hardship. They were often chosen for their beauty, youth, and perceived exotic appeal. Once in Roman households, they were trained not just in sexual techniques, but in entertainment, conversation, and cultural refinement. They had to become whatever their patron desired, losing their original identity in the process. The education that Romans claimed to provide these young men was actually a form of psychological conditioning. They were taught to see their situation as privileged, to be grateful for the luxuries they received, and to accept their powerlessness as natural. This grooming process was designed to make them compliant and prevent rebellion or escape attempts. For those who survived into adulthood, the future was bleak. Unlike courtesans who could sometimes achieve independence or favorable marriages, male concubines typically faced abandonment once they were no longer young and attractive. Some were freed but left destitute. Others were sold to less prestigious households, and many simply disappeared from historical records entirely. The few who managed to gain some influence or protection did so by becoming indispensable to their patrons in ways beyond physical relationships. They might serve as confidants, spies, or intermediaries in political dealings. But even these privileged positions were precarious, dependent entirely on maintaining their patrons' favor. The Roman system of male concubinage wasn't just about individual cruelty. It was institutional exploitation dressed up as cultural sophistication. It created a pipeline of abuse that consumed countless young lives, justified by philosophical arguments about mentorship and social hierarchy. What's perhaps most disturbing is how this system was normalized and even celebrated in Roman literature and art. Poets wrote romantic verses about these relationships. Artists created beautiful sculptures depicting them, and philosophers provided intellectual justification for what was fundamentally child abuse and sexual slavery. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond individual suffering. They created cultural norms that persisted for centuries, influencing how later civilizations thought about power, sexuality, and human worth. The Roman model was copied throughout their empire and beyond, spreading these destructive practices across the ancient world. Modern historians have often romanticized these relationships, focusing on the few exceptional cases like Hadrian and Antinous, while ignoring the systematic abuse that characterized the vast majority of such arrangements. This sanitized version of history does a disservice to the countless victims whose suffering has been forgotten or minimized. Understanding the horrific reality of male concubines in ancient Rome isn't just about ancient history. It's about recognizing patterns of abuse that persist today. The same power dynamics, the same justifications, and the same normalization of exploitation can be found in modern contexts, from human trafficking to institutional abuse scandals. The stories of Julius Caesar, Hadrian, Nero, and Tiberius remind us that Roman ideas of love, power, and human dignity were fundamentally different from our own. Behind the grandeur of temples and triumphs lay a world where ambition, reputation, and personal conduct were all woven into a fabric of systematic oppression. These weren't just individual tragedies. They were the inevitable result of a society that valued power over humanity, control over compassion, and social status over basic human rights. The male concubines of ancient Rome were victims of a system that treated human beings as commodities, their suffering justified by philosophical arguments and cultural traditions that prioritized the desires of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. Their stories, often lost to history or distorted by those who would rather not confront uncomfortable truths, deserve to be told honestly and completely. Only by understanding the full horror of their experiences can we truly comprehend the cost of unchecked power and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. As we look back at ancient Rome, we should remember not just the emperors and their grand monuments, but the countless forgotten victims whose suffering built the foundations of imperial glory. Their pain was real, their trauma was lasting, and their stories matter just as much as those of their famous oppressors. The horrific life of a male concubine in ancient Rome wasn't an aberration. It was a feature of a system designed to concentrate power in the hands of the few while reducing the many to mere objects for their pleasure and political advancement.